Welcome back. This is chapter 4, The World of Words. And so this is building on what we've been talking about in chapters 1 through 3. So when we think about the symbolic nature of language, I think it's great for us to understand this through the study of semiotics, which is the study of signs and symbols and their use of and for interpretation. So it's important for us to remember that symbols are arbitrary. Symbols are also ambiguous, and symbols are abstract. And so when we think about words and symbols, all of these three areas apply. So the principles of verbal communication are rooted in the idea that communication reflects cultural history, values, and perspectives. So in this picture shown to your right, people are celebrating Kwanzaa or participating in a Kwanzaa ceremony. And so one of the things that we think about when we consider holidays or we consider rites of passage, we communicate verbally about these things, right? It will be pretty difficult for us to just be able to communicate non-verbally, even though there are some rituals and there are some holidays and there are things that we participate in or events that we participate in where we do not utilize as much of a verbal repertoire as we would in other situations. But it's important for us to recognize that, especially as it concerns special events that relate to our culture, we utilize verbal communication to make sense and to ensure that we have the right ideology centered for those events. Communication creates and reproduces culture by naming and normalizing practices valued by that culture. So if you celebrate Christmas, there are certain things that you're supposed to know about celebrating Christmas. If you don't celebrate Christmas, there are things that you don't know. For me, when I started celebrating Kwanzaa, something that I had to do was educate people about principles of Kwanzaa and what it meant and how it was different from Christmas and how I will accept Christmas gifts, but I would prefer if a person participated in Kwanzaa with me and what that means and what that looks like. Communication also impacts cultural change. We want to also recognize that language is rule guided. And so as a part of this, our communication has rules which are shared. So there are terms or words or vocabulary that are shared across the board with us. There are also regulative rules, scripts and guidelines. And so we've talked about scripts within the last few chapters. And again, we see it here. So there are regulative rules that we have, for example, in the classroom versus regulative rules that you have outside the classroom. There are rules that you have when you are driving that do not apply when you are not driving. There are also constitutive rules, so ways that we interpret certain rules. So you think about if you've ever been to traffic court, or if you've ever been pulled over for speeding, you may try to acknowledge that there are some constitutive rules that do not apply to you or do apply to you. And depending on how well things work in your favor, if you do get a speeding ticket or you are accused of doing something in an automobile, hopefully that's not too bad, you may be able to argue in the court, or you may be able to have an attorney argue on your behalf that there are some constitutive rules that do not impact you as the way they would other people because of your interpretation or because of the way that a general person would interpret it. So there are also symbolic abilities that are a part of language that helps us to define phenomena. So language shapes perception. So I have this image here about, we're not gossiping, we're networking. And so typically when we think about gossip, it's assigned to women, but men gossip too, right? But it may be called locker room talk, or it may be done a different way that isn't perceived as being similar to what women do when they talk. And so we have our individual and our collective perceptions about how people communicate in that way. We also want to acknowledge that language can totalize. So many hurtful and harmful things are said about people that really eradicates their being, that really hurts. And so it often makes me think about the slogan, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt. So we understand the ideology behind that. Like, you shouldn't allow what people say to hurt you, but words actually do hurt, right? And so we have to be mindful of the things that we're saying, but also the language that we're using, the meanings that we're constructing, and how that could impact other people based on their perception. Language also shapes and reflects relationships, okay? I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but we want to recognize that the ways in which we describe certain relationships and the ways that we talk about other people or we talk to other people says a lot about the types of relationships that we have, the closeness that we have, or the distance, right? Or the harmony or the disharmony that exhibits. Language also evaluates and organizes perceptions. So language reflects and shapes perceptions. We talked about perceptions in chapter 3, and the same thing applies when we think about words and vocabulary, right? So when we consider the way that language works, it's important for us to continue to model mindfulness and model integrity when we're thinking about the words that we're using and how we're describing people and also how we respond to social phenomena that happen in our world. Language can be loaded. I'm sure if you thought about it, there are a variety of words that you can consider or you use daily that have multiple meanings. The first one that comes to mind for me is always fat, F-A-T, to maybe describe the way a person's body looks. You know, if a person is considered to be fat, they may be considered to be overweight, or if something is fat, it is considered to be large or gigantic, right? But fat, right, used to be a slang term back in the day. I'm looking forward to it coming back with P-H-A-T does not mean the same thing as F-A-T. So depending on the context of the sentence, P-H-A-T could be used to describe something like, oh, that person is fat, or oh, that's fat. And it could actually mean like, oh, that person is the bomb, or that person is dope. Pretty corny way to look at it from that perspective, but I think you get the point. So we think about different types of language and different types of words that we use. We need to recognize that certain terms are loaded. Language then can degrade and stereotype others. So there are also a variety of terms that are used to describe certain people that are inappropriate, and again, totalize and hurt, right? So I always think about the term gay, right? Gay means happy, right? And then the other term in which that is used, or how people will ascribe certain things to rape culture when we consider that rape culture is a very hurtful and harmful space, right? And so we have to acknowledge what that means when we consider our symbolic abilities and how language works and how we utilize language, fortunately or unfortunately, to do positive or negative things, even if that's not our intention. We also want to recognize that language allows abstract thought, right? So one of my favorite rappers named Nas, he said, no idea is original. And I always think of that when I think about the abstract, right? So there are words that are used to describe certain circumstances, but they do not have the same meaning for every person. So that's why it's so important for us to have really strong and well-suited interpersonal communication skills. So language allows hypothetical thought and self-reflection. So we can think beyond immediate and concrete situations, thankfully, to language, and that's really important. And we also want to acknowledge that we live in 3 dimensions of time. So we live in our past, our present, and our future. So when we utilize language, we frame it in certain tenses. Through our symbolic abilities with language, we can monitor our communication. So that's what I'm basically guiding you to do through this online lecture, is to monitor your communication, pay attention to the things that you're saying, the things that you're thinking, the way in which you write, the way in which you perceive others, and how you respond based on those perceptions. Also pay attention to the way that people talk to you. What type of language do they use to describe you? What type of language do they use to describe things that maybe are sensitive to you? We can always manage our image using symbolic abilities, right? So if you think about social media, a lot of people are able to manage and organize their images online or their identities online through the use of hashtags, through the use of certain language, through the use of words that they use to describe themselves. And some of that may be true, or some of that may just be who they are in that digital landscape. So keep in mind that we are always managing our image as it concerns the language that we're using. So we consider speech communities. I want us to recognize that speech communities are a language-based group that share norms and cultural meanings. And so we typically see those in three areas. So the first is a gendered speech community. The second are racial or ethnic speech communities. Then we think about gender. A great example would be women who gossip. That could be considered a gender speech community, or men who talk in the locker room, or locker room talk, right? We heard a lot about that with our current president, about things that are said, and so that is supposed to be a part of his gendered community. Racial and ethnic speech communities, a great way to look at that is Ebonics, or African American language, or African American vernacular English, and then economic speech communities. So do wealthy people only talk about certain things versus people who are in different socioeconomic classes? Do they talk about certain things in a certain way, and what does that mean? And so I think to hone in on this idea of speech communities, Jay-Z has a video about the story of OJ. That's the name of the video. And so it is located in your folder for chapter 4. And I want you to take a look at it, and I want you to think and ask yourself, what are some of the speech communities that Jay-Z enters into or he talks about? And what are some of the other speech communities that he speaks to that he may not be a part of? Also pay attention to how this video, the lyrics and the images apply to some of the concepts we've been discussing so far this term. And keep in mind, the video does have some images, even though they're cartoons, they're animated, there are some images that may be triggering, and there is some language that may be triggering. So pay attention, though, to what is said in the video. And if you're not interested in watching the video, you can always go to genius.com and check out the lyrics. So this completes chapter 4, The World of Words. Thank you so much for watching. See you soon.